Fine, James.
Yeah, just come back to this issue that we were discussing earlier about the need for strategic planning. I mean, a lot of the evidence that's been presented to us is that there is a need for broader strategic planning. We've got local enterprise partnerships which have been introduced. To what extent do you think they could act as a vehicle for strategic planning in this context?
I could ask if you could just give fairly brief answers because the Secretary of State is sat outside and your grand position lined up the table and he's waiting.
I'd like to stay behind and listen to that one.
Chairman,
go on then.
all right, thanks, Jim. I have a fundamental problem, and that is of an unelected, unaccountable organisation being given responsibility for some planning matters. And indeed, if the governance 50-50 split between local government and business people, with a business-led chairman, with under corporate governance a casting vote, then you could argue that unelected people are taking planning decisions or indeed strategically planning. And I do have great difficulty with that. I'm not sure that necessarily business wants to be conducting the process of strategic planning or indeed detailed planning. What I think business, certainly in Hampshire, is concerned about is outcomes, of getting the planning process simplified and indeed speeded up. And I don't believe that the LEPs are the vehicle. I think the vehicle for what you said are indeed the upper tier authorities, and of course cooperating with LEPs, but the unaccountability worries me.
It doesn't worry me so much. I think LEPs, a bit depends on the size of the LEP. If you've got a great big LEP, then frankly you're just replicating the old RDAs and you're back in the same issues. I think I wouldn't go for that. If you've got a reasonably small size LEP on a county or 2 or 3 counties, then I think there is a good case for letting the LEPs get hands-on as far as the preparation of a strategic plan. Not just be consultees, but actually get hands-on. Maybe you need the local authority to sign it off, but I'd want them more involved than just consultees.
I agree with Ken. What the LEPs need is not more planning powers, but more resources to ensure the delivery of what the plans have ambitions for.
Okay. Okay.
Low RSS, they would have to come up with the evidence, indeed.
Chairman, thank you. Instead, I think it's fair to say one of the paradoxes of the evidence that we've been presented has been that a lot of people liked the planning framework which was provided by RSSs. But as you know, the reality is that over the last 10, 15 years, we didn't build enough houses. Can you just say a little bit more about the policy drivers which are underpinning the movement toward the abolition of regional spatial strategies in terms of overturning that?
Yeah. In other words, nice policy, pity about the results. And I mean, we want to see more houses built. And we don't think that the regional spatial strategies delivered them, because it really was about ticking the box, go for an ambitious target, and it didn't really matter. There were no consequences for not doing that other than your target increase. So that's why we went for a system that rewarded local authorities, that gave an incentive. I think it's kind of important for government and local government to realise, well, to misquote Clint Eastwood, their own limitations. And what we've tried to do is to bring in a number of reforms that actually work with the market rather than against it. After all, the purchase of a house and maybe the purchase of a car are one of the few things that you can actually barter for. So the market is different. Now, it doesn't mean to say that the incentive is everything. We expect them to move more towards planning and less against development control. Because I think the whole thing, forgive me, the whole thing is kind of predicated on conflict. What we wish to see is communities to work harmoniously together to agree on numbers.
Would you accept, though, that one of the gaps is in this area that a lot of the evidence has been presented to us, a gap around the strategic planning function, that in this disaggregation which you're implementing, that there are some gaps around how we bring planning together in sub-regional areas or between local authorities?
Well, the duty to cooperate is an important function that local authorities have. But this is really about bringing planning closer to communities and closer to the reality on the ground. I do understand and I do appreciate that it is comforting to planners. It might be comforting to... there you are, got a and might be comforting, but it's a system we don't believe works. And the suggestion of a vacuum is completely wrong, because we are now moving to a different system. That different system is now in place in the sense that its principal ingredient, which is the new housing bonus, new houses that have permission now will qualify for it.
Yeah, I wanted to come on and just talk about local enterprise partnerships, because again, a lot of the evidence has been presented to us is about this gap that I was referring to earlier around strategic planning. And I wondered the extent to which local enterprise partnerships, in the way that you're conceptualising it, would be taking on planning functions, or whether it would be a more non-statutory or voluntary cooperation that you would be looking for players around, let's say, for example, in the Black Country that I represent, the 4 local authorities taking on much more spatial planning decisions for the Black Country.
Well, we were quite deliberate to try and get different paces from LEPs and to try and encourage their ambition. And certainly I do envisage that a number of LEPs will move towards this by way of cooperation with one another. But Greg's been actively involved in looking, along with colleagues from BIS at LEPs. I wonder if you might just go to...
Sure. I mean, the answer is, Mr. Morris, it's up to them. There are clearly, if you read it, I'm sure members of the committee have read some of the bid documents, it is part of their ambition, their purpose in coming together is to be able to have joint strategies, to favour economic development, to be able to say to outside investors, if you come to this area, then you will have a planning regime that and a system for processing planning applications that is certain, dependable and professionally organised. And that is one of the ways in which they will present themselves to the world. Some of the other areas, some of the more rural ones, have different priorities, but it's open to all of them to actually pool this sovereignty in that way.
Is it one of the dangers of that approach that you're going to create, because you haven't got total national coverage, as it were, for LEPs, that you're going to have a kind of slightly patchwork quilt type of approach, with some areas having dependable and existing voluntary arrangements, and other areas where there is some degree of vacuum? How do you think you may be able to overcome that?
Well, my expectation is that actually there will be comprehensive coverage. Having seen the enthusiasm behind the bids that have been approved and what's already happening, there'll be further announcements quite shortly. I think it won't be long before actually the whole of the country is covered, which wasn't necessarily, it certainly wasn't a requirement, and it's interesting that ambition has been put forward. But they will look different. I mean, if you think about the regions that preceded them, then actually in terms of economic coherence, I mean, some of them were barely coherent at all. You're having, I think, areas of Hertfordshire linked to Great Yarmouth. That was an impediment to a kind of sensible system of planning. Whereas actually to have, I think you've had someone from Northamptonshire having natural economic communities coming together and actually resolving issues between them, I think will be patchwork, but in a positive way, because actually Britain is a patchwork of different
and I think
focal
it
points
was
of activity.
sensible in deciding to have a traffic light system, of encouraging those green lights of the 20 odd that were first announced, because I think the ones that were quite close have now an opportunity of seeing what is possible. And I think I'm very confident that we'll be making an announcement very soon with regard to the next tranche. I'm so sorry, Mr. Morris, you wanted to say something else.
The planning, so just to be really clear, you don't see LEPs of having a statutory planning function in the traditional sense, but how will that be expressed? Is it a kind of a pooling of sovereignty for local authorities? Is that how you're conceptualising this?
There are two things. First of all, they can pool the sovereignty that they have, which can be considerable. And if you bind together, Manchester authorities being a good example, that is going to be a very powerful set of planning arrangements. But the other thing that we've said is that once these are set up, then the initiative should come from the bottom up rather than the top down. So we are not organising from Whitehall the system and saying you can do this and only that. If a well-organised and highly performing LEP comes to us and says, the partners in this, the businesses and the local authorities, really would like to do things in this way and to take these powers, then I think it's sort of characteristic of our demeanour in government that we want to say yes to that, and we want to find the way to make that happen, rather than to constrain them only to do what is rather sort of meanly conceded in advance.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, just briefly, Greg.